you to this masterclass on investing in America's third Reconstruction. I have today I'm Ed Duggar, and I'm president of Reinventure Capital. My partner at Reinventure Capital is Julianne Zimmerman, who some of you may know because she's been a frequent guest in these conferences. And I have with me today a terrific panel. We have Rilwan Meeran, who is I'm going to introduce them generally because we're going to ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. But Rilwan is leading the development and implementation of a large financial corporation's impact program, practice. We have Rachel Robasciotti, who is a CEO of her own asset management firm dealing in public equities. And we have Jim Casselberry, who's done a little bit of everything. He has managed public equities, he's done private investing, and he's had many years on the philanthropic side as well. So I think we have a great panel for you today to get into the subject of investing in America's third Reconstruction. Perhaps I should start by talking about what is the third Reconstruction. America, for those of you who aren't as familiar with American history as others, I know this conference usually is an international one, and I'm assuming that there are a lot of international folks here that could benefit from a little history in terms of America. America has actually been through 3 reconstructions. Each of them had to do with addressing the imperfection of our founding fathers and our Constitution, and the way in which they let white male supremacy find its way into that, both our Constitution, our way of life, etc. So each of the periods of Reconstruction has dealt with chipping away, literally, at the remnants or the practices resulting from white male supremacy. The first Reconstruction, which actually didn't start with our Civil War, but really started much earlier, was a result of the first attempt to address these inequities. And there were basically 3. One was a lack of freedom on the part of many of our population, blacks in particular, slaves. The second was social equality. And the third was economic equity. So our first Reconstruction chipped away in a way that resulted in our Civil War, and in fact provided physical freedom to 4 million people of color. But it didn't deal with those other 2 inequities, social equality or economic equity. The second Reconstruction, which we call our Civil Rights Movement, chipped away some more in a way that resulted in much broader social equity, but it didn't deal with economic equity. And so now we're in the third Reconstruction, which is the largest and biggest challenge in terms of that chipping away at the remnants of white supremacy. And that's in terms of reaching economic equity in our society. And so we think of where we are today as being in that third Reconstruction, which is really about investing with a racial equity lens. So with that as the background and context, I'll say a little bit more about Reinventure, my firm. Reinventure is what I think of as a next generation VC firm that's put in the same playbook of my earlier fund that provided a return of 32% internal rate of return by investing in founders of color exclusively. And so this practice represents, over 23 years, 25 years of investing this way. And I mention this in particular to let you know that investing for social equity has been literally going on for some time. It's ebbed and it's flowed, but it really harks back. And the other reason for mentioning this is because when we think about impact investing, which you could certainly classify what we're doing, is because so much of impact investing seems to deal with environmental issues. But the genesis of impact investing really goes back to the late 60s, early 70s in this country. And it may surprise many of you that, in fact, the early parts of practice or attempts at investing for racial equity really began with the Nixon administration with what they coined as Black capitalism and the formation of what many of us know as minority enterprise small business investment companies that were specifically designed to advance the growth and expansion of businesses owned by people of color. Somewhere along the way, that shifted, the emphasis changed, but the genesis really begins with investing for racial equity. So with that as a little introduction and background, I want to introduce or have our panelists introduce themselves. And I've asked them to introduce themselves, spend 2 or 3 minutes introducing themselves by saying how they came to this point in their journey, in their careers, to be advocates for investing with a racial justice lens. And Rachel, I'm going to ask you to start. Welcome. How are you? Take yourself off mute.
Thank you. I'm great. It's good to see you all. Thanks for your patience. I've been trying to log in for 15 minutes.
Oh.
It in. Yes, success.
Yes.
So I'm Rachel Robasciotti. I'm really delighted to be here on this panel and with all of you. I'm the founder and CEO of Adasina Social Capital. We're an investment and financial activism firm. And very broadly speaking, we sit within the ESG universe, but rather than focusing on any one particular area, we focus specifically on the intersection of racial, gender, economic, and climate justice. You may have seen some of our work around racial justice investing. It was featured in the New York Times after the racial justice uprisings and was carried in a number of other major media outlets. And my personal history is that I live in San Francisco, but I grew up in rural Northern California in a very poor, segregated Black community. And I've had 3 different family members murdered by the police without repercussion. So when George Floyd was murdered and when the murders of so many other Black men and women have come up on our social media feeds, which is unfortunately mostly how we're seeing them, it's a very personal issue for me. And we've done quite a bit of work in not only on our own portfolio, but also in a broader sense on organizing other investors to use the same metrics for racial justice that the social justice movements who are pushing for racial justice would have us use. So that means we're working with organizations like the Movement for Black Lives, the Poor People's Campaign, those types of organizations to make sure that we aren't simply using whatever metric is available and able to be easily accessed, but we're using the metrics that truly matter in the advancement of these progressive movements for change. And we've had quite a bit of success doing so. Is there anything else you want me to cover, Ed?
Yeah, I think you touched on the important things. I think I wanted them to let them know how diverse private equity, public equity can be in terms of the way it's used, and you're a pioneer in that space. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Just I guess the thing that I would share is that there's been some sense that not much can be done in the public equities space. And what we've found is that if we're willing to look beyond ownership, if we're willing to look beyond simply shareholder advocacy for the positions that we hold in our own portfolio, and we're actually willing to share information and work in solidarity, both with the impacted communities and with other investors, then public markets actually give us this opportunity to make broad systemic change on a very large scale. In 2012, I think CoreCivic, which is one of the private prison companies that movements for racial justice have been so intent on excluding from portfolios, I believe they had their best year, up over 70% before the Black Lives Matter protests began. And this year, they've had their worst year. They're down over 60%. And you can see, if you map it out over time, that there's really a direct correlation between the movements for racial justice and the impact on actual large corporations that are a core part of our unjust carceral system in the United States. So those are the types of issues that we work on, and we work in the public markets because that's where most of the money is, and therefore where most of the power is. So if we're going to make broad systemic change, we have to go where the center, the locus of power, is actually situated.
Terrific. Rilwan, you're running an impact practice, and I described it as a very large insurance company. You can certainly mention their name. I didn't want to steal your thunder, but someone who has come from a corporate background, who is doing this in a new field, if you will, in a new setting. Tell us about it, and you.
Thank you, Ed.
Your journey to get there.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm currently the head of impact investing at MassMutual. Everyone knows MassMutual is one of the largest insurance companies in the United States. I was recruited to come to the firm last year, and I joined early this year to build up their impact practice, to build out investing in best-in-class impact managers, both domestically and internationally, as well as after the May 25th incident with George Floyd. MassMutual wanted to show a lot of leadership in bridging the economic inequality and racial injustice in the United States. So we wanted to leverage some of the capabilities we had as an institution, and we set up direct investment vehicles. First, we set up a specific investment vehicle to invest in Black GPs and first and second time venture and private equity funds, as well as we set up a $50 million direct investment vehicle in Massachusetts to support technology, sustainability, and a separate sleeve of $25 million to invest in Black entrepreneurs in Massachusetts. So, being a private company, they've shown a lot of leadership, and we're working on a number of other strategic initiatives to invest and support African Americans throughout the United States, which has been really great to see a large financial institution like MassMutual play such a leading role in this mission critical initiative. How I got here was, my background is traditional venture capital and private equity. I had the opportunity to work both domestically and internationally, so I spent a lot of time in places like Latin America, Middle East, and Asia, and I saw the effect of foreign direct investment into these communities, both in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Turkey, Cambodia, and so forth, and I saw how powerful capital can be as an economic stimulator to local communities. After business school, I decided to go from emerging markets to frontier markets, and I set up and led the first fund for Haiti and Dominican Republic. So I lived in Port-au-Prince for a little over 2 years, and I set up that fund to invest in that island. And that was immensely challenging and rewarding, and I learned so much about frontier markets and the effect of foreign direct investment into these really nascent economies. And when the George Floyd incident happened, I put up my hand within the firm, and I said, hey, get me in on this working group and let's structure some products to support this wealth gap in this country. And I was fortunate enough to be part of such an amazing company that they were supportive of a lot of these initiatives, and they basically agreed to push forward, and we've structured specific products to invest and support the Black community in the United States.
Thank you very much. And Jim, who has done a little bit of everything and has that sort of long history Please share with us, Jim, your journey to this space.
So
Now, I have to warn you, all of us, the audience in particular, that we're about truth telling. And so Jim will definitely tell the truth as we go.
Again, on the introduction, I guess more than anything else, it just says that I'm old. To introduce myself, I am Jim Casselberry. I am the Chief Investment Officer of Forest Bay Partners, LLC. That's the family office of Steve and Jessica Sarowitz. I'm also on the board of our associated foundation, the Julian Grace Foundation. We're based outside of Chicago in Highland Park. What's unique about our platform is that we are 100% aligned with our mission, both on the family office side as well as the foundation side. And overall, our mission is to narrow the gaps between racial, social, and economic inequalities with a heavy gender lens. Also, part of my task in this role is to find like-minded investors and to help bring people along. So one of the things that we always do is we share a lot of the things we do as far as the models that we create, even to our investment policies for both the foundation and for the family office, so that for those that don't think that they can do it or don't have the advisors to be able to do it, we really like to be able to be advocates and assist in that. For my journey, I guess I'll start way back. That I come from an entrepreneurial family. I come from a family where my grandfather started his first business in 1922, which grew to be one of the largest waste disposal companies in northern Illinois, sold to Waste Management. I grew up thinking everybody had a safe in their kitchen because back in those days, you didn't pay people by check. People got payroll envelopes. My first job was to put the change in that payroll envelope. But my father, grandfathers, and uncles didn't want me to work in that business. They wanted me to go to school and pursue my education. I've spent the majority of my career in institutional investment management, starting at First Chicago Investment Advisors, Brinson Partners, then Ed, where you and I met at the MacArthur Foundation when I was evaluating UNC Ventures. And, from there, I had my own investment management firm. I sold that. I joined Ennis Knupp and Associates as their first minority partner. Ennis Knupp is now Aon Hewitt Investment Consulting. Then after that, struck out to look at a couple of acquisition deals within investment management, as well as consulting to primarily minority investment management firms to help them be better businesses, to help them navigate the ability to be able to get institutional money and to go through the labyrinth of what is the approval process. And from there, by happenstance, my wife was seeing me working within, kind of those 16-hour days, 7 days a week. And she said that, she had met people that were doing good things, that were doing things similar to what I had done at MacArthur, and that I should meet them. And so, long story short, I had the privilege of meeting Steve, and Steve, shortly after we met, said, "You should meet my wife," and I did. And, over the last 4 years, from starting as a board advisor to moving to lead the investment side of the family office, we've been able to create a model for impact investors for how to do it. We have We've used opportunity zones in Philadelphia to convert a convent for 24 nuns to a housing for 24 formerly homeless students, all students of color. We've created a workforce training center on the south side of Chicago, a project that's in South LA, where we're going to create opportunities for people of color to participate in the entertainment industry. In Chicago, we have a $20 million fund that's in opportunity zone that's focused on the south and west side of Chicago to put capital in it. We've invested in several minority-led, women-led private equity funds. Somebody on this panel is one of our private equity fund grantees. So we're doing it, and to the end of when Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and personally, the one that I found more chilling than anything else didn't result in a death. It was Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park. To me, that was the most chilling because Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I kind of expect that. The issue with Christian Cooper of being in Central Park bird watching, and the casualness of privilege of being able to literally threaten somebody's life with a phone call. That was chilling. And, as we were all going through it and we saw people 100 million here, 100 million there, I was able to go back to both my foundation board and to our internal team and say, look, we're doing the work. So we didn't have to necessarily come out with a statement, but what we really wanted to do was make sure that our focus was what we wanted it to be. And, and frankly, where we've come is if we could double down, we are. And, with the work that we're able to do and the models that we're able to create. So that's where we are. That's our story.
Well, I hope the audience sees that we've got professionals here who could have done anything, and yet they have chosen to make this their life work. So part of the question is really why. And I pose that question because, I want many in the audience to be thinking, why shouldn't they be doing this as well? And so one of the things that we do as professionals in this space, financial, is we have to confront conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom often is not true. And so, part of the challenge is pulling apart and dissecting this idea of what is the conventional wisdom that, for instance, in the venture industry says that, well, perhaps founders of color can't build scalable businesses. Perhaps they can't do it profitably. Perhaps inject any bias that you want in there, that they're more risky, et cetera, et cetera. And we have come to know that is simply not true. And in fact, each of us, I'm going to ask the other panelists as well to speak to the conventional wisdoms that they've had to debunk as they've gone along. And I want to just highlight the fact that in addressing conventional wisdom, Jim Casselberry is one of the authors of a paper, a booklet, or I don't know quite how you describe it, but it's entitled, Why Not the Best? Why Emerging Managers Outperform. And in your book, Jim, you talk about things like the Xerox effect. and the deselection process, and big not being necessarily better, and rethinking risk. So why did you think there was a need to write this book?
Well, I'm sure literally all of us have experienced this before, where people say that they need the data. And, one of the things that was frustrating to me throughout my career, there have been scores of papers, of documentation, of the efficacy around minority managers, specifically smaller managers, of all of the things of, being employee owned, being nimble, being hungry, all of those things driving it. Yet it's when it comes to really start to do it, what happens usually is, well, where's more data or where's more information? And so one of the things that at the time for this paper, and, I've actually talked with my principal, Jessica, about we're in the process of redoing and updating that work. So again, to eliminate the questions again, because now people could say, well, Jim, that was 4 years ago. But anyway, right. So the whole idea was to bring together a compendium of information from all of the papers that have been done previously and kind of synthesize that with the experience and the networks that were in place then to really just give a perspective, right? And to simply put, the idea is, unless you believe that all of the talent for investment management is in the 5% of managers that get 90% of the allocations, then you're not doing your job correctly if you're not looking for those managers that are outside of conventional search processes. And so the paper really goes into and uses the example of, that they're baseball players that have turned out to be the best ever but they wouldn't fit into a conventional mold. So similar to investment managers. And then it also addresses some of the issues in the programs that were created. A lot of the programs that were created were offshoots of everybody's program. So they had the same consequence for great managers and for bad managers. So they both ended up getting fired. Mm-hmm. And so what happened is over time, over 35 years, where I've personally seen managers get hired and fired 4 or 5 times by the same clients, and not because those managers were performing badly, but because they grew out of a program and then didn't have a place going back in. Mm-hmm. So the need was, again, to address a lot of those things and a lot of the intrinsic issues that have caused for managers that should grow. And mm-hmm. one of the managers is one of your LPs, at Eddie Brown at Brown Capital Management. Mm-hmm. Eddie is without question, I think, one of the best pure investors. He's second to none, and that includes Warren Buffett. But when you look at Eddie's firm, and we can't cry for Eddie. Eddie's done well and is successful. Yeah. But his firm is about $13 billion. But to look at him compared to Bill Miller at Legg Mason, Ed's better, but doesn't have hundreds of billions of dollars under management. And that's purely because of bias. Mm-hmm. There's no other question. So that's why, it's beyond programs, it's beyond legislation. You have to change. You have to change policy. And so that's where we started, and that's why we're able to do what we're doing, and we're doing pretty good.
Yeah, indeed. So, Rachel, you come up against conventional wisdom. Tell us how you have been able to address them as a private asset management company, one who probably should be doing much better, have much more under management than you do. Talk to us about your experience and why you have still chosen to take this route.
Well, mostly the conventional wisdom that we've come up against is this idea that that all of the indicators of risk, particularly in public equities, are things that can be deduced purely by financial professionals. And what we've really encountered and known for quite some time is that there's this possibility that social justice movements, including the movement for racial justice in the United States and globally, is something that can often be an early indicator of systemic risk in public markets. So for us, it may not have initially made sense why we were looking at issues like having a fossil fuel free portfolio, which by the way also becomes a racial justice issue, or having a decarcerated portfolio that has no private prisons or prison involvement in it. However, with the racial justice uprising that happened this past summer, suddenly our portfolio starts to make a lot more sense. And so I think there's just been this conventional wisdom that all of the information that we'll ever need to have is going to actually come from within finance, and that assumes that all of the material risks are ones that can be known. And we take this very non-conventional approach of partnering with social justice movements, not only because our work is to advance those movements themselves, but also because it's just purely, it's good investment work. It's actually the smart thing to do. It's becoming more and more about what social justice movements are making material factors, rather than somehow digging in and deducing what the material factors ought to be or might be from kind of a purely financial perspective. So I think that's probably the most radical thing that we've done, is to look outside of finance. But I have to tell you, just from my own personal background, I've always had to look outside of finance or academia, because the world that I entered in finance didn't look anything like me. With 98.7% of the $70 trillion of assets that are managed in the hands of white men, as you can imagine, if I was going to create a firm of any size that was going to be able to have an impact, or even honestly in our regulatory environment stay alive, I was going to have to look from the very beginning, kind of outside of who was already in finance and what they already knew. So I think that that's really where we end up landing on that issue of kind of the conventional wisdom. It ends up coming down to data sources as well. We don't necessarily trust the data that's coming through, and it's why we're looking to social justice movements to support them in gathering and using that data in our analysis, as well as beyond just figuring out what the issues are. It's also like, well, what is the data point that's actually going to move this particular issue forward? So yeah, it's that radical idea of looking outside of finance for answers about finance.
Well, Rilwan, when you joined MassMutual and took the initiative to build this program, you had a broad mandate for impact investing. And yet you decided, because of circumstances and your own beliefs, that you would carve out a practice that particularly focused on people of color and their economic well-being. What were some of the conventional wisdoms that you had to help your fellow professionals overcome to do that?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. When I started at MassMutual, they asked me to build a diversified portfolio across sector, stage, and geography within impact, right? And so at first when I joined, I had to educate them on what impact means to me and how we can make a difference with our capital. And so we broke it out into 6 different categories. So larger private equity strategies, venture capital, real assets, women, minority, emerging markets, and private debt. But then beyond that, I said we should have a carve out to focus on Black GPs and Latinx. And so I had to show them the data. And so what I found was that during research and talking to some real industry heavyweights, it was shocking, the disparity in the United States. I mean, today, non-Black entrepreneurs start with 203% more startup capital than their Black counterparts. 20% of Black Americans are engaged in early stage entrepreneurship, but their businesses somehow struggle along the same entrepreneurial pathway. On the lending side, 29% of Black small business owners received loan application approvals versus over 60% for their white counterparts. And then when you look fundamentally, we found that Black GPs leading venture funds had a non-traditional path to venture or starting a company, and ended up with more unique networks and a different lens to evaluate deals from. And that's where the magic is. And so once I proved to them that this is an asset class it's not a luxury we need to invest in, they bought into it and they said, okay, here you go. Here's $20 million to invest in first-time Black GPs and a separate carve-out to invest in Black entrepreneurs. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, my vision is to take it beyond that, but MassMutual, as you know, started in 1851 in Springfield, Massachusetts, so that we're going to start closer to home, and then we're going to create some other programs to do nationwide investing and lending.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. So what has you're looking through this lens, I'll just call it a racial equity lens, taught you about, or perhaps you already knew about risk, rewards, and impact? I'll start with you, Rilwan.
Yeah, when we look at, I'll talk about the direct investing side, Ed. When I tried to stand up this direct investment vehicle for Massachusetts, we looked at some fundamental data, and we looked at the Commonwealth, and when we wanted to see, is it a pipeline problem or a funding problem, we found ultimately that there's no shortage of entrepreneurs, but it was a funding problem. They were less than 1% of all venture capital is invested in Black entrepreneurs. That's appalling, and less than 2% for Latinx entrepreneurs. And so when you look at that disparity, you look to yourself, why is that, right? And it comes down to conscious bias, where people traditionally have invested within their own networks and how they grew up and so forth. But when you expand out of your comfort zone, you realize that the people that are out there starting these companies are really fundamentally further ahead in terms of looking at businesses and opportunities at multiple angles versus their counterparts. And I found that fascinating. And I felt like we need to play a role here.
Mm-hmm. Just to pick up on that a little bit, Rilwan, I mean, did you find there was much of a challenge to you in putting this forth? I mean, in terms of having others embrace it? Or were you just really good at explaining it?
I think right time, right place, Ed. The whole country was coalesced around the knowledge that we all need to do something, that this is something that cannot be avoided or looked beyond anymore. So I would honestly say, luckily, right time, right place, that all financial institutions were focused on this. And then for me, it was just digging up the right data to make the case for it. And once I did, it was a no-brainer for them to sign on board. But MassMutual was always progressive. They were always looking on with different initiatives, even before the George Floyd incident happened. So it was easy for me to convince them, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Rachel, what have you found in having taken the approach you have? What does that reveal to you about risk, reward, et cetera, that flies in the face of conventional wisdom?
You always know exactly the right questions to ask, Ed. Well, it's our belief that the idea of return, just to start with, we've been working with a truncated concept of return. Our return, just as human beings, is a total sort of thing. It's both your personal financial return, and it's also what's happening for you socially as well. So like if I'm doing really fine in retirement, but my best friend isn't doing so well, that actually has an impact on me. I'm not going to let them be impoverished, right? Mm-hmm. But somehow when we enter into truly into the financial realm, we've only been talking about return as the personal financial return, and we've not been including social return in that. And one of my favorite questions to ask folks in this kind of setting is just to reflect, how happy are we with the world that we're living in? Isn't part of our return the social return that we're experiencing as well? Locked down in a pandemic with Martian orange skies if you're in San Francisco from all of the historic wildfires. Yeah. And So I guess for me, it's always been that true return is the combination of both of them. And so we're just bringing back in the other half of the missing return equation. So when that becomes true, you have to start looking at risk a little differently as well. And risk then becomes, well, what's the risk of not solving some of these problems? I may be saving very well and investing beautifully and getting a fantastic return, but is the world something that I want to live into in that future where I've made that fantastic return?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm like, kind of like, what future are we investing for? I think is a really important question.
And I turn to you, Jim, with the same question, around what does this all reveal to you in terms of risk, rewards, impact? This in this case, racial equity lens.
Well, I think that Rachel really just hit on it, and it's a soapbox that I love to climb up on. I think that if we look at Milton Friedman's idea of maximizing shareholder wealth, I think that wasn't exactly what was intended. And as Rachel had pointed to, it's really maximizing economic return. And so if we dissect economic return, it's the component that Rachel was talking about, which is the utility of return, right? And the equilibrium that needs to be created with the equitable distribution of resources within the economy and the society that you exist. And what we've seen the symptomatic symptoms of what happens when that doesn't happen, right? When we see climate issues, we see mass incarceration, we see all of these ills of even politically are driven by this supposed idea of capitalism of just maximizing economic return. Maximizing financial return. So we're seeing what happens, right? So we can change this, right? And so it's because if you do, and we do maximize economic return and how it was characterized, we will have a better economy. We will have a better world. Right now we're only using half of our engine when we exclude all of these underserved populations, within this country, and not to mention the world, but just within this country. So that's part of it, and so for us, we believe that's the opportunity, right? That's the opportunity to be able to. So our program to invest in Black and Brown founders, to invest in impact related, and then to have co-investment rights with those entities. That's how we're able to do that. We've invested in you. We've invested in Lumen Capital. We've invested in Base Ventures. We've invested in all of these managers to be able to source and locate. And then also with the work that Darren Dobson's doing with Lumen, on bias training and for the general market. Because for all the people that we need to be able to bring with us, we have to help educate them, because one of the biggest problems are for those investors that want to do that, the advisors don't exist, right? The supposed experts that when we put on our fiduciary consulting hat, the good stewards of capital are supposed to have experts that help them evaluate their investments and their outlooks. Well, they don't exist, because the model around those advisors don't lead them to be able to go outside of what that normal allocation is. And then you can't hire majority people from Iowa and from Missouri and from Ohio, 26-year-olds that have never had intersection with people of color to evaluate other opportunities.
Yeah.
So that's why we feel that it's incumbent to be able to create new models, to be able to create new paths, and to be able to share what we do and how we do it.
Let's talk about a little bit about different lenses as we're going to shift this conversation a little bit to why others in our audience should join us. But I think just to start with the lens, and I'll give an example. We are effective. I mentioned that my last fund generated 32% internal rate of return. We did that by having a lot of successes. And we did that by investing in people who did not fit the typical mode. They did not check all the boxes that a typical venture fund would have you check. And so to give you an example, I'm going to ask each of you to come up with an example about how your ability to see things differently resulted in a win, a success, if you will. But in my case, I'll use as an example a Black founder team, woman and a man who came together. Their backgrounds were not your typical background. The man involved had been a graduate of Morehouse College. He had a somewhat circuitous path. In terms of his career, he had done well in real estate. He had been Undersecretary of Transportation in the U.S. federal government, et cetera, and done other things, but had this incredible determination and persistence that was attractive. The female involved started off as a nurse, then a flight attendant, then decided that having met someone on a flight, talked about corporate finance, decided I wanted to be in corporate finance, and she never read the memo that said that women weren't supposed to be in that. So she found a way to Wharton, got her MBA, found her way to an insurance company where she was able to practice corporate finance, and then they came together to acquire a business from United Technology. In this case, a small business, $30 million revenue. Within 3 years, they had more than tripled the size of that company to over 100 million in revenues, dramatically increased the profitability of it. And within that same 3-year period, took the company public. Having been a founder investor in that business, that couple, which most venture funds or private equity funds would not have touched, would have said, this makes no sense, generated a return to my fund of 10 times the money I put in it within 3 years. That's because we saw something, we were prepared to look at them differently with our lens that said that, unlike others, we saw the worthiness in their ability. And so we gave them credit for their circuitous path that they took, because it meant that they had not only a business experience, but a life experience that would help make them successful. And so that's what we do. We take a different lens. We have a different way of assessing risk, worthiness, and which allows us to make judgments or make investments in folks who many would not. So do any one of the three of you have an example you'd like to share? Along those sort of lines of how you're looking at things differently has allowed some real successes, some real wins that made a difference. And when I say a difference, I mean not just a return, but what I didn't speak about was what a difference the success of that company made in terms of the ripple effects that it created more broadly in their extended community of both founders and of stakeholders as well as stockholders.
I would say that my experience hiring a diverse team in finance, where I've already given you the statistics about who's mostly in finance and managing money, but hiring a diverse team was very similar. I had to look outside of finance if I really wanted to hire women, people of color, out LGBTQ folks, and truth be told, I mean, we know this as folks who hire, that you really have to hire for the things that you can't teach and kind of like teach and train for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But what I couldn't, so there's a fair amount of mentoring, and you have to kind of go find them and say, this is actually a transferable skill. You would work out really well doing this particular kind of work, even though you aren't already in this industry. I'll show you the ropes. So there's certainly an additional amount of work, but we didn't anticipate the tremendous payoff when we decided to build our investment strategy and deeply integrate with social justice movements. Apparently, anti-capitalist organizations like the Movement for Black Lives or One Fair Wage aren't really going to be happy talking to anyone but someone that falls outside of the standard financial set of folks that they usually see. So when we say that we're different, we actually look like the communities that we're attempting to impact and where we're going to look for the data and the direction that we need for building our portfolio. And I remember being asked by someone who was evaluating us, well, aren't you just doing something similar than other folks that use screening mechanisms? And I'm like, oh, absolutely not. Like, these social justice movements actually talk to us. They don't really talk to finance very often. And we share the information throughout finance that progresses their movements. But I didn't realize that was something that I wanted in order to be working in a firm that really felt like it was creating opportunities for people like me with similar background and beyond. But I didn't realize how much it was actually really going to help the bottom line product that we were creating. And that's just been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Rilwan or Jim?
I'll take one. We literally this just came across the board, and I think I'm okay to go ahead and announce it because I think it's been announced today. But how this started for us was I took a flyer. I went to a conference that was for providers in Boston. I ran across this small little fund that was started by a recent graduate of Brown University, and he had started a platform. He is majority himself, but his platform literally was just built to help immigrants and people of color have an alternative to buy here, pay here financing and payday loans that he had developed. We were able to partner with him both on a philanthropic side and both on an investment side. We brought them to Illinois. They partnered with JP Morgan Chase. They partnered with another group that we've dealt with, the Resurrection Project that's in Pilsen area of Chicago, that's around home ownership for Blacks and Latinx. And we just got the information that Active Cities has awarded them with JP Morgan Trust about $7.5 million over 3 years to be able to, in a combination with this, both philanthropic and investment, to create home ownership on the south and west side of Chicago, and it's a fabulous story. It's a fabulous collaboration of different, both majority and minority organizations, both philanthropic and corporate, that's building wealth within the community, and so literally that started with me working for a family that allowed me to take a flyer to go to a disparate conference that cost $150 to register for. And we find this, and that starts that ball to what's happening now here in Chicago.
Rilwan, do you have something for us?
Well, I'll mention something I recently came across that I'm interested in investing in that haven't closed yet, but still in the initial stages. But I found this company fascinating. Recently, I came across an African American entrepreneur in Massachusetts, in Framingham. His company is called 1854. And that year is significant because it was the first slavery protest in the United States that originated in Framingham. And he's from Framingham, Massachusetts, and he started the company there. And what he does is he builds high-end bicycles that basically are a mix between an electronic bicycle and a motorcycle. And it's a startup company. And unique about his business model as he's thinking about selling these bicycles to the police department and the Air Force Academy is he hires ex-cons to build these bicycles.
Mm-hmm.
And he's hired over 12 of them since he started. And I found it fascinating. I went to his house and I visited him and I visited his manufacturing facility. And what he set up was truly remarkable. And that's what I'm talking about is, when you look at these entrepreneurs, how they came into these businesses at a differentiated path and how they will be successful and by taking the road less traveled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. We only have a few minutes left. So what I'm hoping the audience will take from these examples that we gave is that by using these different lenses, by looking for opportunity among founders of color, people of color, you're able to see that there's a bad news, good news story here. The bad news is that there is incredible inequity in the way in which capital is allocated, particularly to founders of color and women. The good news is that they represent terrific investment opportunities because they're largely overlooked. They still have excellent opportunities, tend to be well priced, and tend to be very appreciative that you have committed yourself and your fund and aligned yourself with them to be successful. And I think that that gives us all tremendous opportunities that we're pursuing. In other words, we are discovering those sort of hidden figures out there who represent great investment opportunity. So with the 2 minutes we have left, could each of you give a word of advice, a parting word of advice to the audience in terms of how they should think about investing? Anyone can start. Now we have 1 minute and 6 seconds.
Okay, get your investment policy right. And if your experts tell you can't do it, fire them and get new experts.
Good.
I would say beyond just looking at black GPs of funds or entrepreneurs, also look at platforms. I think they're a fantastic form of deal sourcing, and they're sitting in the middle of the ecosystem, so they see everything, and they're a great deal sourcing mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
When you're investing in the ESG or values aligned universe, really interrogate the source of the data and why you are attempting to make the impacts that you are and the ways that you are. Are women on corporate boards really the best way to deal with gender issues, for example? Like and is diversity, equity, and inclusion, while very important, the best way to deal with racial justice issues? And I believe that if you inquire into those data sources and who set the priorities, I believe that you are best off financially and we are best off socially by ensuring that those are people who are on the side of justice and the well-being of people on the planet. So the social justice movements.
Mm-hmm. Well, we wrap up with the last 30 seconds. I want to thank Rachel, who is obviously a pioneer in her space. Thank you for making this contribution to this panel, this masterclass, if you will. Rilwan, thank you for participating and bringing the perspective of corporate America to us as well and how you're beginning to shape it. And Jim, thanks so much for your wisdom all the time. So thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
I think that's it. All right, guys. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ed. Much
Right.
appreciated.
All right.
Yep.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.